Okay, hello, Susan. Thank you for joining me today. So we're going to talk about your new book, um, Heroin, and I have it right here. Yeah. Um, I'm so excited I just finished reading it. It's really great.
Okay.
But before we do that, maybe I just want to get your title correct. I mean, you are, Dr. Susan Boyd, you're the Distinguished Professor at UVic at Faculty of Human and Social Development, right? Yeah.
Yes, but I just retired at the end of December. So I think we use that other term now. I'm still a distinguished professor, but what is it, emerita or?
Oh, yes.
Yes.
Well, congratulations.
Yeah, thank you. As you can
You've
see,
gone
I'm
up to
still
the next
doing
level.
some drug-related work because it's my, interest continues.
Great. So just very briefly, I understand, from reading this, it's an illustrated history. So you wrote this book as something for a general readership, right? So because it is an illustrated book with beautiful illustrations, I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about what your goal was for the book as a general readership book, as an illustrated book.
Okay, I think my goal was to entice readers who possibly aren't interested in drug policy or the issues that are spoken about in the book to take a look at it. And what I had done was, in my research around the drug heroin, diacetylmorphine, I created sort of a timeline of events and investigated those events. And then I tried to find visual images, posters, photographs, media headlines, whatever it might be, paintings that that demonstrated those events in some way. Because I thought images also tell a story, and they can also provide an alternative narrative to events too. And one of the focus points in the book was resistance to punitive drug policy. And I wanted to show that not only in text, but also through the imagery of rallies, overdose prevention sites in a park, posters depicting overdose deaths, preventable deaths, and the poison drug supply. But I thought too that possibly someone might pick up the book and just take a further look, because the images were so beautiful. And David Lester, who designed the book, I felt like he did such a beautiful job in placing the images that I chose within the pages that it might in itself entice people. But
were there specific design or layout choices that you made?
I just once I had the images and copyright permission for an image to include it in the book, I sent all of the images to David Lester, but in the text, I told him where I wanted the images to be, sort of image one here, too. But because he was working with the text too, sometimes the image couldn't fit right where I would want it. And it was up to him to make that decision about where it would go. Obviously I could write back and say, no, that doesn't work for me. Or, and there are a few images that I wanted in the book, but the resolution wasn't good enough. And so it just couldn't go in as well. So we had those conversations, but this is a third book that David Lester and I have worked on together. He did the design for Race Shit, and he also did the design for my book Busted, looking at drug prohibition across Canada through the centuries, and now this book. So we have a good relationship in terms of there's never been an issue. He seems to just enhance the image and put it in the text where I hope it would go. And he's also doing the design of the actual text and spacing in the book too. So yeah, I mean, I should say David Lester is an amazing musician and a graphic novelist himself, and his focus in his graphic novels are on social justice issues. So we have common interests, in relation to the work.
Well, it sounds like a great collaboration. I'll just actually hold up some of the.
Oh yeah,
I thought
thanks.
it was really great the way it's laid out. This is some images of
Yeah.
Asian,
Yeah, it's from
anti-Asian
a
racism.
early
Yeah.
National Film Board
Yeah.
documentary.
And then it's so great in
Great.
terms of the so many movie posters and pictures from the stills from the films. So that's really great. Oh, I thought one of the interesting arguments that you make at the very beginning of the text of the book is that somehow plant medicines, I thought that was a really good argument, that plant medicines were replaced by synthetic medicines or synthetic compounds, and the importance of patents. I'm wondering if you could elaborate on that and how that is related to this important, the history of heroin is so tied to that, that question.
I wanted to demonstrate that for centuries, many centuries, the medicines available to people around the world were plant medicines. Not all plants are considered a medicine, but there are a number, and usually they're indigenous plants that people at that time had available to them. And they used those medicines to take care of their family's health and their own health. But in the 1800s, we saw a huge shift, and it sort of intersected with the emergence of science, but also colonization. And I guess you could say the emergence of capitalism as well. But it was a chemist discovering that they could isolate a compound from a plant medicine. In this case, I talked mostly about the opium poppy plant. And so in 1803, a chemist isolated the compound morphine from the opium poppy plant. And from the compound morphine, if you add acetic acid, it creates heroin. So it's just a slight change in the chemical composition of morphine, but it creates a distinct semi-synthetic drug. And really the science around extracting a compound from a plant is the beginning of our modern day pharmaceutical industry. You can't patent a plant, but you can patent a chemical composition, such as heroin or many other drugs. And I think a good example of how the drugs that we use have changed. In 1960, we had about 300 prescription drugs available to us in Canada, for a doctor to prescribe for our health needs. Today, we have over 7,000 prescription drugs for a doctor to choose from to enhance our health. And so we live in a totally different world. But as this shift in the 1800s to the present happened, there is a denigration of plant medicines as being bad, as being associated with colonized people, people of color. There really was a white supremacist framework that was being applied, that these drugs that derive from a plant, whether it be cannabis or the opium poppy plant or the coca plant, that these were bad drugs and that synthetic drugs were good drugs. So we have this shift, which we had not had historically before in such a way, from medical and non-medical use was divided. So the idea that if we use these plant drugs, it was non-medical use and thus bad. And as we know through history, we then criminalized those drugs as well, mostly in the beginning, plant drugs, but then of course we added synthetic drugs as well to the list of criminalized drugs. But yeah, I think there's much more interest in plant drugs now, and there's still disputes within Health Canada and the wider scholarly community about the effective plant drugs and their usefulness. But even with the legalization of cannabis, in the last couple of years, we can see that that plant drug now has moved from the category of bad and criminal, to a category of legal and regulated. And so drugs don't necessarily, even plant drugs don't necessarily stay in their category. There's a lot of fluidity and movement, especially if you look at it historically.
You also mentioned, especially earlier on in the book, about how heroin is criminalized, right? And you mentioned this relationship with the plant versus the synthetic, but you also, as you mentioned just in your comment, that it becomes highly racialized as well, especially anti-Asian racism. So, so we know historically heroin was, in this sense, racialized, right? And racialized in relationship to Chinese migrants, and opium smoking, and different types of imaginations of corruption of women and things like that. I'm wondering, there's this historical racialization. I'm wondering if you could talk a bit about how that type of racialization is relevant to our understanding of how it could be racialized today, or what is maybe the contemporary version of that type of anti-Asian racism. Is there a contemporary equivalent?
I wish there wasn't, but there is. When I was doing my research in relation to heroin, I was looking back at like RCMP annual reports, prison reports, a slew of historical documents that we can have access to, commission reports as well through the decades. And what became quite clear to me, and I had noticed this with my earlier research, was that the Indian Act of 1876 criminalized non-medical use of alcohol and opioids for people who were labeled status Indian by the federal government. And in essence, what that did was criminalize a whole group of people. Didn't change possibly the way they use those substances, but it certainly became a mechanism of social control. But within that mechanism was this idea of sort of a Christian white supremacist temperance template, that abstinence is good and anything else is bad and should be punished. And through the Indian Act, we used the criminal justice system or federal system to punish people for their substance use. And I found that quite interesting, that it was this colonial white supremacist Christian temperance template that was applied for over a century, and that the white Christian citizen becomes the template of citizenship in Canada. But in 1908, when we criminalized the smoking of opium, that was directed at Chinese Canadians who are associated with using that mode of drug use, where white settlers were using liquid forms of opium or pill forms of opium in copious amounts. But the law was directed at Chinese Canadians. And so the intent by the new narcotic division, RCMP, was to close down the few opium dens that existed in Canada, because there wasn't some big explosion of opium smoking, and deported many Chinese Canadians, as well as convicted them for drug offenses. After that closure, people didn't use opium in raw form for smoking as much, and some people started to use illegal heroin, illegal morphine, cocaine. But the law enforcement and the narcotic division narrowed in on the heroin user specifically. It became like the model for who the drug user was, and of course applied to other drugs. But when you look at the early conviction rates, the majority of convictions are for drug possession, which continued through Canadian history, but also for heroin. So like 90% of offenses would be for possession, and almost 90% of those would be for the drug heroin possession. So right from the start, we can see our drug laws never captured the high-level drug trafficker. It really has been people who use drugs. And so when we look at contemporary drug offense arrests, drug arrests in Canada, we can see very clearly through a Freedom of Information request, because it hasn't been listed by Stats Canada in our police reported crime reports, that it's Indigenous people and Black people who are overrepresented in drug arrests in Canada. Mm-hmm. We can see that in some recent studies very clearly. But in fact, when you look at drug use rates, you're not seeing that big difference between non-Indigenous or non-Black Canadians, so in comparison. And when we look at who's in prison in Canada, we can see that Indigenous people and Black people and poor people overall are overrepresented in our Canadian prisons, both federally and provincially. And we have some provinces where the stats are, terrible, like in the prairies for provincial prisons. We can also see in relation to our drug policy, it just doesn't center around the law. The law itself informs other types of policies that we create. And that could be child protection. We can see in child protection that it's Indigenous and Black women who are more likely to be at risk for having their children permanently apprehended from them, especially in relation to the question of drugs. So that's where this race-based, class and gender-based framework continues to today. And
I'm curious, Susan, I don't know if you addressed it in your book, but is there a reason why historically heroin was identified with this issue of racialization of use, right? In the sense of why was there this, fear of races mixing and, the yellow peril and Chinese Canadians having a negative effect on Canadian society? Why was that associated with heroin? Because as you say, there were other drugs being used at the time, cocaine or cannabis or other drugs. Why was it? Why was heroin identified by RCMP and other, if you will, the policy?
Well, I think we should keep in mind that, like, even in 1950, there were about 300 drug convictions. So we're never talking about some huge amount of drug users. We saw the rise in drug arrests and convictions in the late 60s, and that was completely due to cannabis use, white, middle-class kids and not so young people using cannabis. So there's this tremendous amount of federal government and municipal and provincial resources going into surveillance of people who use drugs and also the arrest and conviction of them. But in the 30s and 40s, there was a shift, and it was seeing the trafficker as the racialized other, but the user being possibly white. And so there was some concern about in the 50s of white middle-class kids associating with, racialized traffickers or, being sent to prison and being in close proximity to people who had used heroin for a long time and becoming, hooked on the drug, basically. And so the concern sort of stemmed from that. So there was a period of time where it was white heroin users that were the focus. And I would suggest that even in white supremacist societies, there's a hierarchy around whiteness. So the poorer you are, or working class, you're at the bottom of that hierarchy. And so they were othered. But the racial component of it never disappeared, because it was very easy, and you can see that in the early National Film Board documentaries, that the source of drugs is racialized. So even if it's a white person using it, we can associate that dangerous drug with racialized people and countries that have been racialized as well. So I think similarly with cannabis use, that was very much seen as the domain of white middle class youth using cannabis, and it was white parents who brought their concerns to the federal government. But when you look at arrest rates, you can see that even though, white
Yes.
students were using it, it was Indigenous and Black people that were more vulnerable to being arrested. So that component stays with us. And I think it has to do very much with this, the sort of a white supremacist framework. But I also think that it has to do with our ideas about abstinence,
Yes.
because our ideas about abstinence come from sort of white Christian ideas about sobriety and the Christian morality as well. And most of our drug treatment, our ideas about providing drug substitution programs are centered in this sort of larger framework that stems from, I could say more Protestant temperance framework.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, I think in the book, you give great examples, not least to which, if I recall, Emily Murphy writes that book, The Black Candle, right? Yeah, talking about Christian temperance and its importance, to drug policy, in the sense that it then helps solidify or buttress the notion of abstinence over treatment. I'm wondering if you could talk a bit about how historically then that type of, if you will, early 20th century focus on abstinence then translates into contemporary issues around abstinence and not treatment. I mean, later on in the book, in the later chapters, you of course talk about the different modern attempts to address it through heroin assisted therapy or with harm reduction. But those are always, if you will, initiatives that are pushed back, that are resisted. And it seems like it must be linked to this historical abstinence over treatment. I'm wondering if you can elaborate on that a bit more.
I think it's worthwhile always to look globally to see how different cultures and in different historical eras people respond to drug use, and whether they even label it that. And so it wasn't until we had some early ideas about abstinence right from the 1700s on, but it really didn't solidify until the 1800s in the idea of the anti-opiate movement, and that emerged from what we call, I guess, white Protestant missionaries who believed that the smoking of opium in India and China was evil and should be curtailed. And this idea that these plant drugs somehow led to immorality, degradation, death, and that abstinence was the answer, was the solution to this so-called problem. But other historians have talked about this idea that this was a produced problem, that there wasn't necessarily a problem going on, but once you try to limit or curtail what might be a cultural use, and then you might see problems down the road. But so ideas came from this sort of Christian missionary movement about related to the anti-opiate movement. But those were adopted in Canada as well, with our own anti-opiate movement and our, temperance movement related to alcohol. And again, it was just the positioning of the moral Christian citizen was white and sober. In a lot of ways, it makes some sense because we know most people use some type of drug in their lives. It's a very small percentage of people who don't use drugs, very small. But we also know that people's drug use is very situational too. We know that the path into using a drug or while you're using a drug, that the path out or the consequences of our drug use in contemporary society anyway, since criminalization, is completely attached to our social status. So if we're poor, if we're racialized, the consequences of our drug use, illegal drug use, is so much more severe than if we're wealthy. But I'll get into that a bit later. But what I'd like to say is that this idea of sobriety became adopted by Christian temperance advocates in Canada, but also by the narcotic division and the RCMP. The idea was you have to remain sober. These are now criminalized drugs. It's illegal to use them. And you have two choices, abstinence or prison. We didn't provide any other choice for people who use these newly criminalized drugs. But it was this idea of putting on a pedestal, more godly citizen would be abstinent and moral. And
although I guess not
complete
abstinence, because you could be Christian and still consume beer, wine, spirits in I guess in moderation, but
in moderation. But there was always a endpoint to that movement that felt that all alcoholic beverages should be criminalized. We know that alcohol prohibition didn't work that well in Canada. It was much more prohibitive, or for 14 years in the United States, they had a much stricter prohibition than we did here in Canada. But there'd always been this element of temperance that wanted all substances to be criminalized. But I would say today, we don't necessarily use that language. We talk about abstinence and sobriety, but we're not necessarily looking at the roots of why we think that's a good place to be. And I guess I should say to anyone who's listening that if sobriety or their quest to remain sober in relation to a specific drug, they've accomplished that, then I feel like that's great if that's enhanced your life. That's wonderful. And there should be supports for people who wish to be sober or, remain abstinent in relation to a specific drug. But not everybody responds to sobriety in the same way. And in the book, I try to communicate that for that small percentage of people, then we need to provide different avenues for them. And they could be harm reduction services, changes in law, changes in what we even consider treatment in itself. And some scholars, and not just myself, others have been writing about this, is that now not only do we see the sober citizen as the ideal citizen, but we criminalize people who use illegal drugs, but we also pathologize them. And we started doing that from the late 1940s on. People who used illegal drugs were seen as pathological. And so now we use the sort of DSM,
So in talking about sobriety, maybe this is a good moment to pivot to that part of your book. I mean, sobriety obviously brings up this notion of, is this a habit, as you say, or a disorder, right? And so it brings up this issue of recreational use, not habitual use, use, and then also it being so habitual that it becomes a disorder or is framed as a disorder. I think in the book you give a great example of Vietnam veterans who return, that study that suggests that many vets used heroin, I guess, situationally, but when they returned, they didn't necessarily, as to use the language of the book, they didn't necessarily develop a habit for it.
That's right.
And return to, if you will, pre-war life. But still, we began, as you suggest in the book, to create a language of disorder or mental disorder or medical disorder, as opposed to understanding drug use as a habit. I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about that, this distinction between habit and disorder.
Yeah, I mean, that early study in relation to Vietnam soldiers is a landmark study, and obviously others have built on that, looking at social and cultural factors in relation to our consumption of drugs. And what they felt about that study was that it demonstrated that the drug heroin itself is not as compelling as once thought. I mean, it's a potent narcotic. We shouldn't, fool ourselves about that. But, people are given potent narcotics, whether it be morphine, hydromorphone,
fentanyl.
Yes, in clinical hospital spaces, and they're considered to have therapeutic value. But it was to say that we need to look at the social and cultural dynamics. It's not just pharmacology in itself that leads towards lending itself to dependence or the word addiction. And so they wished to explore substance use quite differently and started to employ the idea of a habit, because a habit is neither good nor bad. And what it means is that someone begins to have an activity on a regular basis. So whether you have my habit is reading books, or whether a habit in relation to a person's drug use, but that it's not necessarily criminal nor pathological. But we've, since the 40s, seen it as drug use as both criminal and pathological. And now we have severe opiate use disorder. So in Canada, in order to receive drug substitution, let's say hydromorphone, which is dilaudid, or this few, we have 3 heroin-assisted treatment clinics in BC, you have to be diagnosed as severe opiate use disorder. And so you can't receive that drug substitution treatment unless you are labeled that. And what scholars and myself are suggesting is that possibly a small percent of people who use drugs do have mental health issues. No one's denying that. But the majority of people who use illegal substances do not. And in no way does our use of pathologizing people or seeing them as having a disorder lessen the criminal justice surveillance of them. And in no way does it in any way provide support for recreational users, who are the majority of users. And they too are vulnerable to overdose death as well. And so we have nothing set up to provide support for occasional users.
I guess that brings up that other way in which heroin, not only is it about sometimes use, habitual use, and then disorder, but it's also, as you point out in the book, how it's attached to mental health, right? In the sense that now we have ministries called Ministry of Mental Health and Addiction, that addiction itself is not understood to be, if you will, a separate phenomena, but rather it is attached to mental well-being. I'm wondering if you can
I think I think this movement to bring those two together in relation to our ministries, because that's also related to funding, is really misinformed. I don't think that they should be under the same umbrella. It's to recognize in relation to, let's say, a Ministry of Mental Health, that yes, a small percent of people with mental health problems could also have problematic or problems with substance use. But to see people's drug use in general as linked to mental health is problematic. And I think it's an avenue that we shouldn't have gone down. And, one of the things I want to make clear to people who might be listening into this Zoom is that even when we look at the American Psychological Association, it's called the DSM, and it provides a criteria for opioid use disorder. So it's considered a pathology, a disorder. But when you look at some of the criteria, there's 11 of them. Quite a number of them, you could say, are actually social and cultural in the environment that people use drugs in. They have nothing to do with pathology, but it's, condensed or it's brought together as if it is. So one of them is spending a great deal of time obtaining or using the opioid or recovering from its effects. But I would say anyone who's poor who uses opioids, including heroin, does have to spend a lot of time finding their drug, because first you're trying to find the funds, whether it's through recycling or a part-time job or volunteer stipends or their regular job, the money to purchase on the illegal market, which is a poisoned drug market now. And so that's due to social and cultural factors, class factors, not due to necessarily a pathology. And another one is, using opioids in physically hazardous situations. And if you think about someone who's poor, possibly homeless, or precariously housed, if they're purchasing an illegal drug, it might be very visibly on the street or in an alleyway. That's sort of the image that we have from popular culture. But the longer you have that drug on you, the more likely that you might have an encounter with a police officer or an RCMP officer and be arrested. So the quicker you use that drug, that small amount, the better it might be for you. And so you might find yourself stopping in a doorway, hidden in an alleyway in order to consume your drug. And so again, this idea of what is a hazardous situation? When you're poor, a lot of your housing and the physical environment that you live in is slightly hazardous. And so the difference in relation to, let's say, someone who's wealthier, and an interviewee brought up Keith Richards of the Rolling Stones, so I apologize to him, but I'm going to use him as an example. He writes in his book about his life that he used heroin for a number of years. But he was also quite creative during all those years. But he had access to buying large amounts and good quality heroin, so that he didn't have to be on the street and vulnerable to arrest and vulnerable to overdose. He also had, the funds to support a good legal defense if he was arrested, which is not available to most poor people in Canada. He also could bring in supports if he wanted to, nannies, cooks, all the things that he needed to keep his life going. But I think it speaks to, in many ways, how our social status in society really, the consequences of our drug use are quite determined by that. And when we see people receiving legal, safe, heroin-assisted treatment in other countries and Canada, we see that they're able to have a stable life, non-criminal life, if that was the case, and what they would say a normal life that most Canadians would wish to have. And so I asked the question is it the drug that leads to degradation and despair? Or is it the discrimination and stigma and the lack of a legal, safe supply that leads to such negative consequences? And I would conclude that really it's the lack of a safe supply and the incredible discrimination and stigma that's placed on people who use criminalized heroin and other drugs. I mean, there's rarely, you have to be rich like Keith Richards to have a steady supply of heroin. Most people are interchangeably using hydromorphone, heroin, tunnel threes, codeine, any narcotic.
Although famously Prince died of a fentanyl overdose in his home,
Completely.
right? So he's a very wealthy, famous celebrity, but even
It's not to say that it wouldn't happen, Mike.
Yeah.
That's not what I'm suggesting. I mean, we should always keep in mind anything like a central nervous depressant, which heroin is, and fentanyl is, alcohol is. There can always be the risk of overdose if taken too much. If you take too much.
But I understand your point. I think your main point is that, and maybe you can elaborate on this. I think the main point that I get from the book and from your argument that you're presenting now is that drug prohibition punishes a very small group of users. That group of users often is racialized and poor. But I guess the the question that comes up is, why is it that drug prohibition, is it designed to punish the poor and the racialized? Have we created, if you will, an environment of disinformation and fear,
right,
specifically targeted at this group, this underclass? Or is it just, if you will, a historical accident? Or is there a rhyme or a reason, or is there, if you will, a structural or socioeconomic reason why drug prohibition is designed to punish this small group?
That's a very interesting question, because I think it's linked to our colonial policies, which continue to this day. I would say part of it is designed because our colonial framework that exists to the present day is premised on white supremacy and ideas about the white Christian subject. So I would say that, yes, I do think that it's integral to the policy. And we look back at the Indian Act with the criminalization of non-medical use of alcohol and opioids, intoxicants, how they framed it, and the 1908 drug law to criminalize the smoking of opium. Definitely race-based. It was focused on this group of people, and white settlers originally didn't feel like these laws would apply to them. I mean, eventually it did capture white people in Canada, but it never lost its original purpose, which was to marginalize and criminalize people framed as the other, and that was Indigenous and racialized people in Canada. So I think there was quite a bit of intent, especially when you read some of the historical documents, the Jesuit documents, the RCMP documents. There's no doubt that people were othered and not seen as fully human or as deserving citizenship.
I'm thinking of a lot of the images that are in the book, since it is an illustrated history of heroin. And the images are about, of course, movies, movie stills, posters, so on and so forth. And this is popular culture generating this kind of hysteria about all. And I think, as you show in the book, heroin and other drugs all get lumped together as a fear of, if you will, excessive use, the lack of temperance. So if indeed we have a cultural production of fear and disinformation about drug use, it's not necessarily targeted, especially later on in terms of movies from the 70s, it's not necessarily targeted at poor and racialized people, right? Some of the films are about the fear of the middle class being dragged down, right, by heroin use. So if there is a general, if you will, miasma of fear about drug use, but there's also, if you will, a specific type of criminalization, prohibition, surveillance, monitoring, assigning police to seek out specific populations for, if you will, punishment and incarceration, the racialized and the poor. How do you see those two things working? There's a more general fear of drugs, and then there's also a specific, and it's very much attached to heroin, racialized and anti-poverty, and not anti-poverty, but fear of the poor, focus on prohibition.
I think we sort of have the official fears and claims about drugs that were criminalized, sort of the RCMP police narrative about these drugs that generated a lot of misinformation about people who use drugs and about the effect on the person when they consume those drugs. But alongside of that, popular culture embraced the production of narratives and films, books about people who use drugs. And when you think about it, I mean, when I was doing some film studies, I remember reading about early film producers really loved playing with the new technologies in relation to like opium dens and sort of the smoke from the opium pipe and the opium dreams. You know, how would you capture that on film? So, and it also created wonderful narratives, you know, sort of caution films. This drug, you know, if you take this, it'll be the disintegration into death and despair. But how do you capture that on film? It's quite boring if you show someone who's legally receiving heroin or some other narcotic from a physician, and they get up, they eat, they go to work, they participate in society in every way that we think is the norm. But you know, films are created on drama, and so most films have employed the drama, or what we would call the addiction narrative, which is that you try the drug, you become instantly addicted, immediately you start behaving in immoral ways, in criminal ways. You develop, you know, this habit, and death is usually the end result of the in these cautionary films. But I think this is what interests me, is that our ideas come from multiple places. You know, our information and knowledge about something, you know, an event, or comes from multiple places. But when we think about it, who's reading scientific journals? Who's reading social science journals? You know, who's reading the journal, you know, like the Journal of Addiction? For most people, they've never met someone who's used heroin or another criminalized drug outside of cannabis, let's say, before the law changed. And so their ideas are coming from popular culture, and popular culture most often portrayed and depicted, you know, people falling into complete despair after using heroin, and that the traffickers of these drugs were most often racialized and violent and greedy. And that's where we get our information. So in some ways, I don't think it's surprising that we have a little bit of trouble wrapping our minds around the fact that this picture is misinformed. You know, it doesn't give us the full spectrum of what drug use is, or the people who use it. And right from the 1940s on, people who were criminalized for their heroin use talked about, well, if I had a legal supply, you know, I could be, I could function, you know, and be stable and live my life as a law-abiding citizen.
If I may interrupt, why do you think it's so difficult to change that narrative, even though we've had, if you will, years of organizing social justice activity, organizations that you feature in the book, like Vancouver Area Network of Drug Users, CAPUD, Canadian Association of People Who Use Drugs. You have all of these organizations, different coalitions, who are working to, if you will, correct the image, correct the narrative, and to inform the public in a better way, in a more clear way, in a more, with greater veracity, truth. Why is it that then these narratives that you just talked about, the misinformed narratives, why are they still the dominant ones? I guess that would be the question. What are your thoughts on that?
When I was looking at these issues, I started to think about, because of, you know, current events in the United States and in Canada, sort of a white supremacist surge in relation to COVID restrictions, and also in relation to the United States in terms of gender inequality and reproductive equality, that we have long held ideas, possibly not even understanding that they are that, in relation to the racialization of people. our ideas about gender and justice, our ideas about our bodies and reproduction. I think white supremacy has always used tools of punishment to divide groups of people and to differentiate between themselves and others. I think it's deeply entrenched in Western societies, but especially in the United States and Canada. I'll use those as examples that I know best. And that even our ideas around, let's say, homosexuality, that, you know, it's only recent that homosexuality was criminal. And we hang on to those ideas, and we can see that there's always a simmering movement that wants to push back on having a more inclusive, representative society. And we're experiencing that, you know, in Canada, United States right now. So I do think our ideas about race, gender, class, sexuality are deep, and that they derive from this sort of Western produced, because I don't want to say that it comes from anywhere else, but sort of a Western Protestant framework of society and of the moral citizen, very much others. And that's part of our history. And sometimes we see breaks from that. You know, some people might frame that as, you know, sort of a more liberal society, but we know with certainty that nothing's a given, you know, in relation to our laws and our policies. Are all human made. You know, we can see examples, you know, in relation to not just current ones, but even in relation to World War II and the rise of fascism and authoritarian nations, that the idea of othering and white supremacy is very much part of the fabric of societies. And that hasn't disappeared. And we may not use that vocabulary. You know, someone goes into drug treatment, let's say, and they're using a AA or NA model, or 12, what we call 12-step model. They might say that, well, you have to, you know, give your will up to a higher power. That doesn't have to be God, you know, it can be any other belief system, and people work around that. But I would like to look a little more deeply at, you know, the premise of these frameworks, and to look at the roots of them, and to see how, in some ways, it creates more problems than allowing a person to have larger expressions in their drug consumption, or other ways to understand their drug consumption, than that they have a disease, or that they're criminal, or that they have a disorder. I think that would be much more useful, because it is so linked to the, you know, sort of race, class, and gender injustice.
Sure.
These roots of injustice. You know, but I say that, but I also, you know, there's a huge pushback on harm reduction, and I've talked about in the book. It's not, you know, the answer to our issue. It's harm reduction emerged in some ways to curtail a bit of the harm from drug prohibition, you know, and so the state is quite powerful. And when you look at harm reduction services, you know, it's run by volunteers, often very poorly paid people, you know, only getting a small slice of federal funding, where abstinence-based treatment is still gets a majority of funding. But to understand that harm reduction was necessary and continues to be necessary because of the harms of drug prohibition are so severe, and how they shape other policies as well. As I said, like health policies, child protection policies, housing policies, education policies. You know, it's not just limited to the law.
So do you think the current strategies that are attached to the law are still effective? And I'll bracket that by saying in the end of the book, or in the last few chapters of the book, you talk extensively, I think, about the contemporary history of uh, advocacy for harm reduction, for safe injection, for heroin-assisted therapy, for treatment in general, so on and so forth. And a lot of that history in the book is about actually Supreme Court challenges or charter challenges. So we know that the charter challenges have been successful, for example, in maintaining Insight as a site on Hastings. But other charter challenges haven't been so successful, right? In the sense of expanding heroin-assisted therapy, for example, actually providing diacetylmorphine to people as a treatment. So it would seem that that charter challenges and other legal tactics have been successful, but maybe just marginally. And yet it would seem like and the book, I think, details that activists continue to use that kind of legal instrument, not least of which I think at the end of the book, you mention a drug user liberation front, DULF, and also, I think Kaput as well, about how they're trying to create a safe supply. And again, through charter challenges. So I'm wondering if you could comment a little bit about that tactic of the charter challenge and the efficacy of it, and what are, if you will, things that we can do in the future. What is to be done in relationship to advocacy?
Yeah, the Charter Challenge has been like one avenue for activists to try to change drug policy and to provide different types of services and to change our drug law. They're very expensive and they take a long time for their conclusion. And in one way, I think that in relation to drug prohibition, our activism has to be on many fronts. There isn't just like one place to center our activism. I think it hits so many different areas of our society that we do need to have a sort of multi-pronged movement to end drug prohibition. But in terms of let's say the Charter Challenge around Insight and the Charter Challenge that didn't around heroin-assisted treatment, they're premised on the idea that addiction is a disease. And so that by denying a safer injection site, by denying heroin-assisted treatment to this small group of people is an infringement of our charter rights. And that it's a health issue, that it isn't a criminal justice issue, it's a health issue, and that provinces should be allowed to provide health services to people. So I was happy with some of the outcomes, also quite challenged myself about this idea of positing people who use criminalized drugs as having a disease, and that their drug use is under the domain of health, because I see drug use, or I understand drug use as both a social and cultural and health issue. And the charter challenges don't necessarily adopt in any way a social and cultural understanding of drug use. So in one way, the charter challenges have moved ahead some issues, but in other way, the courts are deciding what drug use is for Canadians, and are they do they have the knowledge to do that? I would say no. But so that's my issue with charter challenge. But I totally understand using that avenue as one way to challenge our drug laws and our policies. I do, even like Kaput, our national drug users, have submitted a charter challenge in relation to our drug laws, saying that infringes on our rights in relation to especially drug arrest for possession and for small amounts of drugs, for selling small amount of drugs to support one's own drug use or habit. I
So what?
understand that movement, so I wouldn't say we should curtail that, but I think in the meantime, we have to try to speak to the public directly, our politicians, our health officials, our policymakers, about the wider issues, sort of systemic injustice that's embedded in our drug policy on all levels, but also that our ideas about addiction are quite flawed, and that it would be beneficial to try to understand better the cultural and social factors that shape our drug use and the consequences of our use too, instead of centering in on this addiction as disease, addiction as disorder narrative.
So given everything that you've just mentioned, all of these issues around history, around systemic discrimination, around bias, around the socioeconomic reasons why we've criminalized heroin, what are your thoughts about the possibility, which you talk about at the end of the book, about the legalization of all drugs, like the campaigns to legalize all drugs, in a sense, to erase that type of stigma that is attached to drug use, and to, if you will, naturalize or normalize drug use as, if you will, not necessarily this medically, a medical mental health disorder, but rather just something that people do, like, as you suggest, that you read books, right? So what are your thoughts about that possibility in the future of the legalization of all drugs, to remove all prohibitions? Is that something you see on the horizon?
Well, it's what I would advocate, because some of the I would say, what would you call them? Our drug policy is quite piecemeal, or our advocacy is a bit piecemeal. And so when we haven't been able to address it as a whole, and we could decriminalize drugs, that would be quite easy, actually, to do that in Ottawa. But we're not really then dealing with the poison drug supply. The illegal drug market will continue. And we're not really then able to deal with other issues. It would be a wonderful thing to do right now as a first step. But I would like to see legal regulation of all drugs. And I think each drug could be regulated differently. I don't think it should be blanket legal regulation. We have different regulation for alcohol, tobacco, cannabis now. But I would like us to move into sort of a civil regulation of all drugs. I mean, alcohol and tobacco are our most toxic drugs. They're the ones that we're most risk for health issues, linked to health issues. And we have found a way to live with them. We may not, it's not perfect. I'm not saying it is, but it's civil regulation. And that means that prison time is not necessarily attached to infractions of our regulatory system for those drugs. Even with cannabis, we ended up criminalizing some aspects of cannabis use still. And I would have preferred it was all civil regulation. So moving forward, I would suggest that we should look at all criminalized drugs and try to create a framework for each of those. And to say that it doesn't have to be a static model, like in terms of, let's say, heroin, the dalcetomorphine, that we could have clinical settings where people come to the clinic and receive safe, legal heroin under a doctor's supervision. We could also have compassion clubs where people from drug user unions and allies are providing safe, legal heroin to people outside of a medical clinical environment. We could also have, which has just happened recently through Portland Hotel Society, one of the doctors there prescribed fentanyl to a patient. He took that prescription to the pharmacy, had it filled out, and then he will determine when he will take that drug, consume that drug. And one of the benefits of the Compassion Club model, as well as the prescribing to the individual who goes to just the pharmacy, is that they can work with their own drug use patterns. They can figure out what's needed for themselves. Not to say that they're a doctor or pharmacologist, but just to say there may be days where a certain dose isn't necessary. And there may be other days or situations that they're in where they feel like they need a bit of an increased dose, but allows them to find what their drug use patterns might be. Our drug substitution programs in Canada are centered around habitual use, regular use of the drug.
Yes.
And we don't really supply anything outside of
You're
that.
referring to methadone or hydromorphone as
Yes,
substitutions for heroin.
that's right. It's daily use of the drug that it's premised on. But through history, we know, like Florence Nightingale was an occasional user of opioids.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Yes, and so she obviously was able to regulate her own use. Sometimes she used more heavily, other times not at all. And we look through history, we can, there's other prominent people that actually used opioids situationally and occasionally. And we really haven't created a framework outside of now cannabis, alcohol, and tobacco for people to possibly know what their pattern of drug use might be. I'm not saying that there shouldn't be supervision around people's drug use. We lack good education about all drugs, and that's desperately needed. And the way that we communicate that knowledge about drugs, we need a lot of work there. But it's to say that we could provide varied and culturally diverse services that would work for people instead of very narrow programs that, I suppose don't work for people. If we really want to do something about deaths and harm, we would create more diverse services. If we find they don't work, well, it can't be worse than what's going on now, where we've had over 26,000 deaths in the last 5 years, preventable deaths due to a poisoned illegal drug supply. So it's worthwhile shaking it up.
But part of that is, I think, that we as a society allow, and I guess here's my comment, we allow that type of death to occur, those stats to mount, because we see that population as not us. I think that's the main issue.
Yeah, not worthy of our care and concern. I think that was so apparent when COVID emerged, and the federal government, provincial municipalities, they immediately, within a week or two, changed policies to protect people from getting COVID. And we saw the whole sort of governmental framework shift, and the funds to do so as well. And this has been going, in 2016, we declared a public health emergency in BC. The Yukon just this year declared a public health emergency. No other province has, even though there's deaths every day. And you have to wonder, why are people who use criminalized drugs seen as less worthy, as less human? It's people that we love, our children, our husbands, partners, friends, who are dying daily because of our inaction. And if there wasn't a time to change our drug policy, I don't know what would be a better time to curtail all of these preventable deaths. And not just, the deaths are obviously one outcome of our drug policy, but people are harmed in multiple ways, through our drug policy. That's the ultimate harm. But certainly there's more that we could do if we valued people's lives in Canada.
Well, that's great. Thank you, Susan. I don't really have any other questions. I think your answers are so exhaustive in the sense that I think when you answer one question, you actually cover 3 or 4 questions that I have. So thank you for this interview. This is really great. Is I guess one last question would be, I think sometimes, we wonder as readers, would you have written this book differently? Now that it's all bound and published and has amazing images and a beautiful typesetting and fonts and design, is there something that you would do differently in a second edition? Is there something that you would add that's not in here, or that you would change?
I might have tried to add a little bit more, because it's interesting about a book, like you think you see all the tenets and strains through it, and you try to give a forceful ending and things like that. But sure, there's some things I might change in my conclusion in relation to making more forceful my argument about the roots of drug prohibition in relation to sort of our colonial white supremacist and Christian temperance ideology. And I think I would have made possibly a bigger argument at the end too, that around the world there have been heroin-assisted treatment programs, and there's, I do say this in the book, but I don't know if I made it clear enough that, there's been no drug diversion problems in relation to drug substitution. That's always been a fear that the police have communicated, that, oh, if we have, legal heroin, it will get into the, get sold to people in the illegal market. But to say that there has not been one death at a drug substitution program, there's not been one death in BC associated with our overdose prevention sites and supervised injection sites, and that drug use rates have not increased in any substantial way in countries like Denmark or Switzerland, where they offer heroin-assisted treatment, to try to, dispel some of the, I think, which are natural fears because of what we've been taught for decades. Yeah, I think that you always come up with stuff, it goes to print and you're like, oh my God, why didn't I put that in? But, then you have to write something else. So I don't know.
Well, I guess that would be my second footnote, PS note. Is there another book that you're working on now that?
Not really.
No.
I'm working with Dolph a little bit, the drug user.
Liberation Front.
Yes, thank you. They're writing a short history of their group.
Oh,
because what and I mentioned that in the book, that there's histories across Canada. They're very location specific, and it would be just wonderful to hear these histories of resistance to drug policy, how it unfolds in Winnipeg, how it unfolds in Montreal, in Halifax, and, Sydney, Cape Breton, that all of these histories are important. And I wish there was funding, to provide the space for people to write these histories, whether short or long. And so Dolph is working on a short history of their group, just how it came about and what it's doing, because there's great interest around the world about these resistance groups, especially in the United States, where they have even less access to alternative models of treatment or criminalization. So I'm going to give it a rest for a bit, because when you, as you know, when you take on even an article or a book project, it takes a lot of time and energy. Yes. And I thought I'll focus for now on these smaller little projects, but to try to just communicate the events in the book, to try to change policy, to try to educate people about these issues. instead of racing into something else. I have ideas, but that's never been a problem for me. I have a lot of ideas for books, but whether I have the physical or the mental energy for that, I'm not so sure right now. I
Okay,
want
but
people to know about this book.
but I look forward to your next whatever it might be.
Okay.
I look forward to that.
Yeah, and thanks, Mike, for inviting me to speak with you.
Oh,
I
my
really
pleasure.
appreciate it.
Yeah.
And
Okay,
the
well,
good work that you do.
oh, thank you. But excellent book, amazing. Definitely will assign it to students and recommend it to friends and family. I think it will make a very nice a coffee table book for a Christmas gift.
I have to tell you, I mean, this doesn't have to stay on your what you show the students, but a friend of mine whose mom is in her late 90s, she sent me, and I've known her since I was 17 or 18.
Okay.
Anyway, part of my extended family. She took a photo of her mom in her late 90s sitting on the couch reading my book. And it was just so lovely because that was my intent, from a
Yes.
teenager to
Sure.
senior citizens and up, basically to have something accessible to read about these issues.
You knocked it out of the park. It's very accessible. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Anyway, so that was my intent, and I'm so happy to see varied people reading it that are outside of the drug policy field. Definitely, yeah. Anyway,
Okay.
thanks so much.
Thank you so much. It's been great. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.